E ka rakatira, e ka kamatakitaki tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sari Blandula hou. He tēnā mihi ki te mana whenua, ngā tuahuiri, ngā tāhu mō te manaakitanga. Welcome everybody to this talk with Henry Turner and this wonderful exhibition, Fever, which I should be saying with a Peggy Lee type lilt, but I'll leave that to you. Fever is the second exhibition of Henry's work we've had at City Art, following on from Deep Gold last year.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sure, I'm sorry. Henry is a student of classics and art history, a litterateur, a scholar of poetry, fiction, art, history, and I believe maps.
Well, yes, I'm a bit map obsessed at times. So you must understand I'm, well, not quite a dilettante, as that implies that there is no purpose for finding things out. It's just that the purpose is a bit obscure and the purpose for all those things finishes up in here, so the definition is a little, well, I'm not altogether a classicist. I'm motivated entirely by visual greed.
That's a lovely way of describing it. You have described this exhibition as an integration or a braiding of the emotional, the physical, and the conflation of the conceptual and the figurative, which is a lot, and I'm sorry to send this long sentence to you. But what is your starting point? Is your starting point with this exhibition the actual landscape, a metaphorical landscape, or does emotional context come first?
Well, the starting point was probably the emotional context. Is immediately before my first show here, Deep Gold, opened. I was visiting a friend, and while going home, the idea of using landscape as a marker first came to me. I must explain at first that a few years ago I had a spinal operation, and well, I'm inclined to assume that there was a mix-up of some sort, but anyway, it turns out the dose of methadone was altogether too high, and so, well, when the cold turkey set in, it was in the height of summer, not a few months after this, and I live near Westmeld, and so in this great flat dry land, and so the hotness and the dryness became deeply, deeply horrifying, and it was something which I became highly allergic to. It was terrifying on a considerable scale, but of late it has become necessary to, in the first place, confront this fear of the open landscape, and then, as it seemed a good idea at the time, to transform the hotness and flatness and the nor'westers and everything else into the land of milk and honey, which I don't think it ever was. So that was the starting point. It was a sort of it was an exculpation of a giant paddock.
Right, right.
I doubt that makes any sense at all.
No, it does. And is that did that need to be a specific giant paddock? Is this the giant paddock that's on your doorstep?
Yes, indeed. It is an extremely specific landscape. Well, I don't want to go into too much boring detail or anything, but it is necessary to understand that when the Waimakariri was in deep time when the Waimakariri was creating the Canterbury Plains, the area around West Melton and North, sort of where the airport is, was where it was last. So the soil is basically non-existent. It is masonry and shingle with a pocket of dust here and there. And so this is the driest place, as the rainfall is in the aquifer within five minutes. And so there aren't any giant farms, and so it has remained an open landscape, and that is, as you say, directly on my doorstep. You know, there are thousands of acres of open land, and it can be a terrifying thing to live beside in a very real way.
I can understand that with the openness, and with that comes the bigness of the sky, which is a very Canterbury thing as well.
Indeed, yes.
But as part of that as well, the human impact over several hundred years of change, is that part of the perhaps frighteningness of this landscape?
It was at the time, but this work is not about nature. It's not particularly even about the landscape. These are in a very weird, they are in a very real way conceptual paintings entirely. They're all wearing masks, and underneath there is nothing.
Nothing.
Well, there is an eerie matrix of ideas.
And I think that is a balance that you get so well between figuration and the conceptual. That's always probably going to be read as landscape by some, or as purely by ideas by others. Was that a hard line to take? I mean, how far did you veer away from the actual? How far did you hold on to the ideas?
Well, I've explained in other formats, and there is some writing in the book on this matter, that the work is trispherical. In the innermost sphere, there is the emotional content. In the secondary sphere, there is the landscape. And in the third sphere, there is what I have done since. And so there is, of course, a degree of there is a degree of collusion between each function of the work, but it's mainly a timeline thing, depending on what I was doing at the time and which stage I had reached. It was the genesis of this work was, I would say, about 9 months ago was when it first began, and it's been in progress ever since. Well, until recently, when the show opened, really was when my engagement with them ended. So there has been time for things to have happened.
So there is a sort of a progression, and I don't know, two works, for example, The Sun Is Up, which is the one there on the right. We've talked about that before, as a sort of a contentedness, there's a serenity.
Yes. Well, in each of these paintings, there is a different emotional content, arising partly from where I was when I was working on it, and also of the fixed moment in my memory which I was depicting. The two are separate, but they sort of became commingled, partly, and of course, a result of the fact that quite a lot of this work was done over lockdown, which, fortunately, I live above my workroom. So, in the weeks of isolation, I was working for a great majority of the time, and so, yes, indeed, one can point to anything, to any work in this room, and I can relate its content in that respect, yes.
Right. So the gold, and there is a searingness to some of these works, you know, they really glow and shine, and at the opening when we had these plants around sort of shading the light, the works just shone out. But that's not indicative of any one emotion, is it? That's used in various...
No, the gold was more my personal inclination. As you see, I haven't used blue. I haven't used the colour blue in about 6 or 7 years, I think. And so this arises from the endless, all day long blue skies in that summer. But when you don't use blue, and when you don't use anything to do with blue, you have to engage with the other colours in a different way. And gold is, I think, a natural response to this. And also because gold is a very practical thing to use also. But yes, the gold itself does not intrinsically reflect the emotional content, because the gold in this context is the sky, and the sky is not answerable to emotions. Emotions are answerable to the sky, but not the other way around.
And that would apply to the darkness, and we talked before about there is another vision, which is second from the left there, where there seems to be a darkness, which I sort of slightly seeping into the work or gnawing away at the work, but that can't be ascribed to any particular emotional feel either.
Well, that's the thing, to attribute the physical features of a painting to such contests as this, it is a subjective exercise. And sometimes it happens that you might be working on something, you could be painting, I don't know, a fire or a sky or a storm or something, and you only realise much later, months and months later, sometimes, it suddenly strikes you as a sort of modest revelation that you were subconsciously illustrating something which you might have read in a book, or which you might have seen in a dream, or in other ways some narrative content perhaps that you had no idea of at the time. So it can be difficult, but the dark seepingness which you described was partially a reflection, and that this was like, well, what I was saying, that you only realise these things afterwards, that there's a story in the Bible about how God appeared in a thorn bush, which must have been uncomfortable, but he appeared in a giant flame to Moses, presumably when he wanted to really make an impression. And so if God can appear in a thorn bush, I see no reason why Mephistopheles couldn't appear in a bush either. And being Mephistopheles, who likes to show off, there would be a lot of blackness seeping out.
Yes.
But I didn't realise this at the time.
Well, in your exhibition last year, Deep Gold, that had a stronger sort of narrative element that was inspired by or on the Henry's trip to the subantarctic islands, and it had a sort of a fictive journey implicit in it, in the bizarre landscape and the sense of an explorer going into this incredible environment. With this, there's very little life apart from natural life. Is it unpopulated or depopulated?
Well, this show is totally separate from the last show. There is really very little in common at all. The last show was a narrative, a sort of fake Victorian science fiction adventure which I wrote in my cups, and the paintings were descriptive of that, but this is completely different. There is no narrative at all. These paintings are the expression of the idea of plants as a marker within the landscape, and a marker of my experience within the landscape. You see, I cast about and decided that the surviving native plants, which are very, very few in number and quantity, would be the best expression of the passage of time and the passage of experience in a place, because there's nothing else really. But there are no people in these paintings. There aren't any visible people. There's nothing alive except for the plants, and presumably the insects and the birds, which are also there by degrees. But in my mind, and when I look at them, these paintings, these empty vistas are full of ghosts. And I can see them very clearly. They're dressed exquisitely, and they're all having picnics and reading books and things, and they're having a fantastic time. So I'm not sure if this thing, I can't see. See, the way I view these is totally subjective, because I can only see them the way I see them, and my nose has been 2 inches from them for so long that I'm not altogether sure what's up and down anymore. I'm not sure if anyone else can see the ghosts in them, but they are there.
Did you put them there, or is this something you've identified later, afterwards?
Well, they were already there, because these places do exist. All these places are real, and you can go there. And in going there, I've never met anyone else at all. I mean, the first 2 paintings over there, they are a real place. That particular paddock is enormous, and I go there from time to time to escape everything else, because no one else goes there, and therefore there is no human agency there. And so to go there is to be alone, but you can also bring along friends, which I've done once or twice. And there's also ghosts there, and so I go there to see them from time to time as well.
I remember somebody saying the time they feel least lonely is when they're in the middle of a desert all by themselves, and it sort of brought back some of those ideas.
Yes, indeed. And in this show there have been the engagement of ideas from other people. I mean, in the last show, Deep Gold, the only element of literature was mine, because I wrote the story. But for this show, I've looked at the stories of lots of other people. There is a lot of literature going on. And that paddock over there, as an example once more, is about a 7-kilometre walk from where I live. So sometimes I take a bag with an apple or something and a few books, and I go there and I lie underneath those trees and I read the books, and that was really, I think, perhaps the most formative experience and the most direct influence in the show, the literature, and the subliminal ideas and sort of visualisms of them.
Can you give some examples of some of the books you were reading, or the defenders?
Well, I must start with Borges. Jorge Luis Borges, who's one of my favourite writers. He was an extraordinary writer. He was in Argentina, and he became blind later in life. He was an extraordinary writer. And well, my engagement of literature is sort of dependent on experience, on what I was doing at the time, and literature reminds me of that as much as anything else. And so I was visiting my friend in Oamaru, who wrote an essay which is in the book which accompanies the show, also called Fever, and I bought from him a copy of Borges's Labyrinths, and the first story in Labyrinths is Tlun Ukba Orbis Tertius. It entirely defies any form of description, and I am, at this moment at least, entirely unable to recount what it is or what it stands for or what you experience when reading it, but it is, I submit, a formative book to read, and a part of it is set in the remoter regions of Argentina, in the Pampas. And although Borges doesn't describe the Pampas whatsoever, in my mind, the events of the book, the events of the story which concern another strange book which contains an entire world in its pages, or rather a fragment of that world, I saw this story as taking place in a landscape similar to these. I've not actually been to Argentina, but that's the subliminal idea which comes into mind, and that subliminal idea is the most important thing, because that's what you see, that's the image behind the eyes when you read, and that's of very great importance. And so I took Borges and I took this particular story in my bag down to this paddock, and I read it there, and it was a most amazing experience, and it was vital to the formation of the work. There were other books as well, but that particular story was, I think, the most crucial, I think, and also music as well, of course.
I was going to ask you about the music. In what way is music important for this exhibition?
Well, it's of enormous importance, and the show itself is called Fever after the song, which I first heard by Janice Gray, but it's also been sung by other people, of course. And, well, there again, it seems to be descriptive of a hot and dry landscape, and it makes a lot of sense when you listen to it in that context. And so, again, for every painting in this room, I can describe the emotional content. I can also recount to some extent the influence of literature and also the music which I was listening to, because it's all very specific, and it's of enormous importance in my practice.
There's a completeness of any painting, but with these works, that completeness extends to the frame and extends in some cases to the outer frame where there's two frames, and also to the gallery, to the plants, there's to the flowers. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but it feels like a whole sort of cosmos, or a whole experience in the exhibition as a whole. Is that how you see them? Is that how it's been?
Yes, indeed. As I say, the idea of the sphere is crucial to my way of conceptualizing this show. I know this is very esoteric, but when I say it, it doesn't sound very good when I speak of all these airy nothingnesses, but in my mind these things are real, and that sphere does exist. But it's a glass. It is a glass sphere which you can see through and hold, and I held it all the time when I was doing these things. But yes, the idea of completeness within a sphere, of a world within a sphere, is of great importance. I mean, there are some important spheres which I've obliquely referenced. There is the Hieronymus Bosch, the Garden of Eden, you know, the enormous altarpiece panels. I mean, everyone looks at it when they're open. You can see all the jewel-bright creatures and strange things within. But when it's closed, there is a depiction of the world before creation. Yes, at least in my imagination, this probably wasn't his intention, but it seems to me a world before creation. And it's a single plain with trees and mountains within a grey and pearly sphere. And there's also a depiction of the ancient Greek conception of the world, which, well, being ancient Greece was in the middle. And it was again a flat pane, a one-dimensional surface, well, a two-dimensional surface which fell off at the edges and which was within a sphere, and it was the sea below and the sky above. But this idea of completeness was very much the way in which the work was made and completed, and of course the frames are of great importance because this gouache on gesso surface is very fragile. It's amazing to work on. These panels were made according to the recipe of Cennini, which was set down in about 1450 with only a few alterations. The gesso was applied with an air gun, for example. But painting on that surface, it's like painting on a marzipan fruit cake or something similar. It's got that sort of slightly soft richness and ivory coloured too, of course, because it's that substance. But that's carried through to the frame also because it's got to be under glass, and it's got to have its own atmosphere inside in which it can live and breathe like some creature. But the frames are also of great importance. absolutely. And the inner surfaces are painted like these two, for example, with glossy yellow flutes, or with the blood red sky with yellow stars. In fact, this painting here was, I think, it has something of New Year's Day, the first day of this year, which was when there were the fires in Australia, the enormous fires, and all that smoke drifted all around the world. And when you looked up, the sun was red, and the light as it came down was red, and there was a thick orangeness in the air, and you couldn't smell the smoke, but you could smell the idea of smoke. And so this itself was highly influential. The third painting over there, the Matagari, the moment that describes is when I looked at that thorn bush, when I walked down in this strangely hellish orange haze, as I've always been fascinated with the idea of hell and heaven, which is also within a sphere. So there's a sort of blizzard of spheres altogether.
We've talked a lot about sort of the ideas and the experiences, but as an artist, when you go out, are you equipped with camera, sketches? Do you draw first? What's the actual process behind it?
Well, I must confess, I got sick of plein air painting when I was about 7. It's a total pain in the bum. And so that being, because I work almost entirely from ideas and from memory, I mean, these are all 90% of the source material, horrible words, but anyway, was behind my eyes, so it was a very direct process. I did not draw when I was in that place. It felt altogether unnecessary, but also it felt as though it was an infringement against some unwritten rule. But that may have been a dream.
Doesn't matter really.
Well, no, it doesn't matter. But interdicts applied in dreams are very powerful, and definitely some of these were composed in dreams. You know, when I woke up and that's the thing to do. So then I went down and started work immediately.
I've been throwing questions at him. I'd like to open the floor up to any questions.
With these paintings with folds, where did you get the idea of the folds?
Folds?
I can see the sort of the plough marks there, but then it turns into the folding in those two and the end one.
Well, I did not conceive those as folds. That's the first time I've ever considered those as folds. These structures here, which appear there and then carry on towards the end, they are baked earth, which has been carved. There's various ways in which you see exposed earth. There's rabbit holes. There's the ground so dry where nothing grows, and there's only rocks and dust, and also there's the channels, of course. But the main reason for doing so many terraces and carved layers of baked earth was when I looked at the Maestar of Duccio, who was not particularly famous at the time, and he's not particularly famous now. He was about, I can't recall, about 1350 to 1410 or something. But when I looked at those paintings, and those paintings, like most paintings at the time, were tempera on panel, so they've got a lightness and a dryness already. Because that's the other thing about gouache on panel, it feels, apart from being like a marzipan fruit cake, there's also a dryness and a lightness which seemed entirely appropriate for the very dry desert harshness of what I was doing. But there's also a softness to a desert as well, which is one of the paradoxes of the places. But there was a way they used of constructing a narrative space, as though it was like a theatre set, as though the rocks and the ground and the buildings and the walls and everything else are just wafer-thin layers which you could pull a cord on somewhere and they just whisk away up into the flies. And there's also, and I also saw in his work, and it was a bit like a mirror in these paintings by this person who's been dead for so long. I saw something about somewhere else, and there was a creamy milkiness of the light, which I suddenly realised I'd been working with for so long. I mean, some of these paintings are in the harsh bronze sun, but some are in the sort of milky, creamy light, which also takes place more towards the end in these ones. And so it was the amalgam of dry, baked earth and dust, and the strange, well, it's not ethereal because it's also quite harsh, the clarity of the light. So that was, in light and shadow, that was where the carved earth arose. If that answers the question, I'm not sure.
There's lots of cliffs around Waipara that are similar to that.
Yes, I believe there are. But that's the thing, I'm sure other people would see in these paintings elements of other places. I mean, there must be landscapes like this in lots of dry places around the world. I've even seen in my mind some of them myself, but for me these are only one place. They are nailed to that very specific location. And so that's how I see them forever and ever.
So that painting second from the right, is that a rabbit hole depiction?
No, that's a hole that drops straight down to hell.
And above the temple,
Well,
the floral arrangement, or a light balloon arrangement, is that heaven above the colour?
no, it didn't strike me. It didn't come to me at the time that this was heaven or hell. I mean, I'm fascinated with the idea of heaven and hell, and that's something, and the idea of heaven and hell, and of salvation and damnation, and also the everlasting nature of a place that someone or some people have invented as a convenient place to stow the dead. It's a fascinating idea, but the sky in that painting, which was the most technically difficult. I spent so many hours trying to wrap my head around those soft, pillowy, pearlescent clouds. That was. In fact, this is only just coming to me now, that there's a thing that happens when there's a big nor'west wind and this huge amount of cloud against the Port Hills. And so a few times a year at most, it happens that the sun shines at sunset, but it also shines against these clouds and reflects back and fills the shadows with a soft orange light. And it's one of the most amazing things, and that was that, and the imagery on the frame around it sort of arises from that, as well as a couple of pages in Salman Rushdie, which, come to think of it, also took place in the Argentinian pampas, in which the character describes walking endlessly through the night, lit only by the stars, and she lay down and looked up at the stars in an attempt to evade chronic insomnia. And that's something which that wandering at night, looking for natural light in the darkness as a way to find solace or find sleep, is something I've identified with myself once or twice. The one at the end of the wall over there, the one with the purple sky, is about 4 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep, and there was a delicate purple mist, and the stars had halos. And so in that way, experience and the idea of literature become, well, by literature I mean specific instances described by a writer in a book, they become sort of fused and inseparable, and that's the kind of food that these paintings eat, because these paintings are like 17 mouths. They've been eating me, and they've been eating my food, and they've been eating the landscape for quite a while now.
I have a question about your little, I guess your signature, the little gold token. Is it got your initials and the date on it?
Yes, indeed. It says HT and 20.
Is it what you're saying about ghosts? No, I can't stop seeing it. That they feel like a little, like a token, like a little man-made thing that's been kind of like left behind. And I just keep seeing them. They're floating around in different spaces. But I feel like you're very particular about where you put things. So I'm really interested in why they are where they are.
Well,
why it is what it is.
they're definitely not man-made, I assure you. I didn't. It's fascinating that you say that. I'd never thought of the cartouche as a physical expression of the ghosts, but now that you mention it, it makes pretty good sense. It may have been subliminal at the time, but in terms of signing things, people generally want things signed. I mean, if I were left entirely to my own devices, I mightn't sign things at all, except for some writing or some kind of scribble on the back. There's quite a lot of writing on the backs of some of these, because the panel's got an obverse. And when I was working on it, I would hold it like so, and lug it about and carry it around. My workbench at home has got space against the wall for exactly 7 of these side by side, so I could work on 7 at one time, a little bit on this one, a little one on that one, through the days and nights. But I made a resolution a few years ago that I wouldn't sign things with a curly squiggle at the bottom right-hand corner ever again. And while studying Japanese prints, ukiyo-e with Richard Bullen a few years ago, there was an entire coded language. It was a bit like a trademark sign, or the wee R in a circle, that the prints would have. They would have a whole bunch of them, the artist, the studio, when they were done. And so I thought I would steal that, because as I say, I study art history and classics mainly out of greed, because I get bored very quickly, so I'm always trying to find new literature, or a new edition of Borges, or the Rilke poems, or Buchner plays, or whatever. So I thought I'd steal that, yes, and I would float it about, and there would not necessarily be that ostentatious, there would just be a little gold scale which would float, as though levitating within the landscape. It seemed a good idea at the time.
So is that what in there, all those signature things there, that looks like it's floating and it's a little bit of...
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Yes, gold on gold works pretty well, and it seems to me suitably ghostly at the moment.
I feel like it's hard to sort of sign something without it, put your initials on something without it feeling almost like a headstone. Or like graffiti, and I
quite like headstones.
Oh, well, it's not so negative. I'm really into them, and yeah, they feel really Japanese to me. Yeah.
Well, that was just where I sort of nabbed the idea.
Yeah.
That's the only... Well, actually, come to think of it, I suppose it isn't quite the only Japanese thing. I've been greatly influenced by a single chapter, it's about 12 pages long, of the tale of Genji called A Branch of Plum. And that has been seeping like creeping oil through things in my practice ever since reading it. And also the Japanese tradition of dry gardens with gravel and rocks. I mean, I studied that a few years ago, and that was long before this body of work had ever occurred to me, but even then I thought this way of making a garden, even in so wet a place in Japan where you have to keep raking everything every day to stop it getting covered in moss, this is something that makes inherent sense in this environment near where I live. In fact, I don't want to sound arrogant at this point, but it seemed to make far better sense there than in Japan. So I don't know what that says about me.
What about Japan?
You spoke of your aversion to blue, but you do seem to have weakened a wee bit in some of your paintings here, that there is a touch of blue.
Is there?
Yes.
That's indigo.
Oh, well, there's teal. That's not blue. Well, I mean, supposedly people...
Indigo, which is a slightly deeper blue, more of a purple.
What about the blue in the sky on the second one?
That's teal.
Well, there isn't any blue there either. I mean, it's that the closest, I suppose, on the colour wheel, a device I loathe, the closest thing I think I get to blue is Veronese green. It's one of my favourite colours, particularly when used with white. I've heard it said now and then down the years, I've heard people say that you can decide whether sort of tealy colours are blue or green, but to me they're green and not blue. Because being an artist, and particularly in the postmodern period, there is a slightly intoxicating notion that within this context what I say goes, which isn't to say that everyone else isn't absolutely right, because they are, and everything is subjective, but in my mind I use ochres and golds and greys and browns and yellows and oranges and pinks and reds and purples and greens and everything else, just not blue. I'm quite stubborn.
Any other questions? No, well, thank you very much for coming, and I hope everybody will have a chance to look at the works themselves and at the book of Fever that is due out. And many thanks to you, Henry, for a fantastic show and a great talk. Thanks.
Thank you.